So, one of the hardest parts of joining a dating app, beyond finding the star-crossed love of your life, can be describing yourself. It's hard, right? I mean, you're trying to describe an entire life, an entire personality, with just a few meagre words. Well, even though here at MatchMaker we're not that kind of matchmaker, it can feel the same when it comes to making a description for your podcast. They're far more important than you think. In fact, one of the number one factors as to whether someone will click play on your newest episode is how good your podcast description is. It really is one of the first things that people will see. So if yours is good, you could gain yourself a potential listener. And if it's rubbish, well, they'll swipe left.
Are you looking for a podcast or radio show to appear on? Are you struggling to find a guest for your podcast or radio show? Let me introduce you to MatchMaker.fm. Simply create a profile, narrow your niche, and use the inbuilt messenger to contact potential partners. And the best part, it's free to sign up. So, let's find your match.
What is a podcast description and why is it so important? Well, it's just as it sounds. A podcast description is what your show is about, who it's for, and why you should listen to it. Your podcast description needs to give people a flavour of what to expect from the final product. Now, it's quickly worth mentioning, try not to get these mixed up with your podcast show notes. Your show notes should be different for each episode, whereas your podcast description stays consistent. It's like a book's blurb. So, your pod description, it's an elevator pitch. So we're going to provide you with a sort of checklist in a moment, but just to go over the essentials of what you should be including. As a baseline, it should have the essence of your show, its target audience, and the promise of what listeners can expect to gain from tuning in. Consider it your opportunity to leave a lasting impression. The more intriguing and engaging your description, the more likely a potential listener is going to think, hey, that looks interesting, and click play on your podcast. So be bold, but keep it short. So just thought we'd mention as well, we do often get people coming to us and saying, hey, Matchmaker, you know those podcast descriptions, are they crucial to our SEO performance generally? Well, the good news is there isn't, so you don't have to worry too much about your vocabulary hitting the marks. So don't worry about cramming in as many optimized keywords as possible. Listening platforms only make recommendations based on the episode titles and the podcast title, not the pod description. So don't worry, you're in the clear. Just focus on making a great description without having to appease the SEO overlords. So where do podcast descriptions go? On all major podcast listening platforms, your podcast description will sit just inside your podcast profile. And whether that's Spotify, Stitcher, Google, or Apple Podcasts, it'll typically be at the top of the page in close proximity to your latest episodes. So yeah, right there. Now you can see why we're stressing the importance of these bad boys. 5 things to include in your podcast description. Now we've got the what, why, and where out of the way, it's time to actually buckle down and focus on writing your podcast description. Descriptions shouldn't be ridiculously long. Try to make them as concise as possible. And with that in mind, number 1, about you, the host. Creating a good host-to-listener relationship is essential for any good podcast or radio show or anything where you're really talking to people. If somebody's regularly tuning into you, you're kind of building a relationship there. So telling any potential listener a little bit about you is a great place to start. Don't say too much though. There's a fine balance. For example, if you sell yourself as really chatty and then on the show you're a little bit more quiet, reserved and meek, then people are going to feel a little bit like you missold your podcast and they might not want to continue listening. The goal with any podcast really is to get people to resonate with your content. If people aren't getting what they signed up for, they're not going to resonate with it. So yeah, keep it light, not too much. They'll get to know you properly by listening to your show. Number 2, who your target audience is. Like we said, it's really important to speak to your listeners directly always, and your podcast description is a great place to do that. Take some time to think about who your podcast is aimed at and write that down. Providing a relatable statement is one of the easiest ways you can attract your target audience. If you directly call them out, they'll find it easier to connect with you. Number 3, what can the listener expect? Like we mentioned earlier on that topic of properly representing yourself, being transparent about the content you're putting out is key. For example, you might find talking about your show's genre useful. If you're a comedy podcast, for example, let them know that they're in the presence of a comedy legend and that this podcast is going to get them laughing. Sounds simple, sounds like you're over-explaining what it is, but that's actually paramount to podcast description success. The goal is to spark interest, so managing people's expectations can save everyone from wasting their time. Number 4, what value will your listener get? So, let's talk about when you're actually in the process of trying to spark interest for your show. You can just say to your listeners, you should be listening to this podcast because it's great and I'm great and you're going to have a great time. But basically, with any content, there has to be some sort of gain for them, whether it's entertainment, whether it's education. They need to know what they're going to be getting from listening to you. So let them know, will they be learning something new? Will you be covering a specific topic on your show? Will it just be mindless background chatter that makes you feel a little bit more at home? You need to really think about your USP. What are you offering that other podcasts aren't offering? Number 5. Your release schedule. Now, this one's a doozy. It shouldn't require too much thought or stress, but it's really, really important to make sure that you're including your release schedule in your description. You would be surprised how often people forget this. It is a common mistake. Always put in your release schedule in any bio, whether it's an Instagram post or your podcast description, is just good practice. It's going to tell your potential listeners when to expect your content, and it's going to get them hyped for it, basically. Some great podcast description examples. So we decided to get out there and pick out some excellent podcast descriptions just to get those creative juices flowing. You might deem some of them a little bit paint by numbers, a little bit simplistic. Sometimes that's a really, really good thing. First up, we've got example number 1, the Always Sunny podcast. You don't need to be a fan of the gang's antics to suss out that this is a great podcast description. Now pause to read if you'd like. Well, it's got a concise description that gives the reader a good understanding of the podcast theme. You've got the 3 hosts introduced, Glenn, Charlie and Rob, the stars of the show as well, which is even more incentive to listen really, because your target audience is also identified here, and obviously it's fans of the TV show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The description clearly states what value the listener will get from the show. So, it's offering a behind the scenes insight. It's offering something that you wouldn't get elsewhere. Our second example number 2, That's Why We Drink. So this one's even snappier and it's even shorter, and we like it because of this. We like it because of its simplicity. The short and simple structure of this podcast description really gives the reader a concise summary of what to expect. And within only a few sentences, they've made the show sound fun, interesting, and engaging. Plus, the release schedule is made clear. Finally, example number 3, The Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett. Again, another massively successful podcast, and that may well be in turn thanks to this amazing podcast description. We really like this one because the description provides good context about the host's personality, about the host's life, and also the podcast backstory, why it exists. In today's crowded podcast scene, first impressions are everything. That's why nailing your podcast description is super important for standing out from the crowd and snagging those listeners. Thanks for watching, and as always, give us a little like, give us a little subscribe, and good luck with your podcast descriptions.